In the United States, we saw the beating of Rodney King by the Los Angeles Police Department about 30 years ago. That was covered by mainstream media, believe it or not. It was on TV, and those of us who were alive, we all saw that. Over the last 3 decades, while reformers who essentially are looking for that gentler version of genocide, preached for cops to have control over who sees what with body and dash cams, independent journalists and the average citizen has gained the ability to FTP, or film the police. This is how we saw Eric Garner get choked to death in New York City, and how we saw Mike Brown lying dead in the streets in Ferguson. We protested, the Black Lives Matter movement began. We interrupted the Democratic presidential debate on national television, but again, not much changed. And policing and mass incarceration stemmed directly from slavery, with Jim Crow in the middle, and now we have new slaves, and not much has changed since the civil rights era. Then all of a sudden, the whole world saw Derek Chauvin suffocate George Floyd for 9 minutes on the streets of Minneapolis. And like Eric Garner, he said over and over again, "I can't breathe." And for some reason, the protests erupted. This was the biggest sustained protest movement in our nation's history. Defenders of lives of color and anti-fascists were on the streets in every state. And we knew it was time. There were a number of activists, myself included, Zoya, Patrona, Anh, and others, who knew each other a little, but hadn't worked directly together on any specific action or cause. But we came together in late April, early May, because we knew this was the time to take advantage of this opportunity. Mobilizing was happening. The passion was there. The terror of the terrorism of the police, and what it's all for, which is the enslavement of certain criminalized populations, was coming to the forefront. What we understood was that we needed demands, because protest has to be for a purpose. The protests all over the country force the power holders to listen and give us a seat. And as Shirley Chisholm said, if they don't, bring a folding chair. We knew that if we got a seat at that table, or we knocked the table over, or we pushed ourselves into those city council meetings and into the mayor's offices, that we needed to have concrete demands, making it clear exactly what needed to end today and what the solutions were for a more humane, just society. So we built the 10 Demands for Justice, the road to abolition. It focused and continues to focus primarily on 2 areas: education and action. As far as action, as soon as we released the demands, we put them in the hands of protesters. We distributed print flyers to activists in cities across the country so that they had them to guide them as they were facing off with police and risking their lives. We've also expanded our efforts to include all people in this country who may not, due to COVID, due to family, due to priorities, may not be willing or able to risk their lives on the street and face further police brutality, but may also not have enough money to donate to mutual aid groups in their areas, but want to make sure that their votes count. They want to make sure that their elected officials understand that if they do not act on behalf of their constituents, they will not hold office any longer. So we have created, through ResistBot, letters that you can send to your mayor, your governor, your state Congress, and your national Congress representatives, all through your phone by sending a text. This informs them of what we're focused on and what needs to be done. This is their opportunity to either take the lead or to be silent and lose their office and their power. Finally, we created a song. I'm a hip hop artist, and we created a song with all proceeds going to Movement for Black Lives, another opportunity to give what we could back to the people most impacted by racism and classism in policing, prosecution, and sentencing. Finally, when it comes to education, our primary goals have been to dispel the myths about cops in cages and the myths about abolition and what it means. So I'll run through those very quickly for you, and then I'm going to pass you on to some of my cohorts who will break down the specific demands pretty quickly. Cops in cages do not deter crime. Cops don't stop crime. They don't solve crime. In fact, they increase the likelihood of future criminality and increase the size of the criminal population. In no other job on earth could you be successful 2% of the time and not only keep your job, but get raise after raise and pension, et cetera, make $100,000 a year or more. But that's the case with the police. They solve 2% of all major crimes. Prisons don't rehabilitate. They dehumanize, they isolate, and they destroy safety nets, which leads to recidivism. We're not making our country safer if we believe that we're putting people in prison to come back out again and be functional members of society. What happens when people are away is they lose their family connections, their community connections. They come out and they don't have a job, they don't have a house, they don't have a car, and they're felons. So they can't get a job, a house, or a car. When it comes to abolition, abolition is not anarchy. It's not a lack of accountability. It's not about absence. Like Ruth Wilson Gilmore said, it's about presence. It's about building life-affirming institutions or remedies for the underlying causes of crime, like jobs training, education, substance abuse treatment, mental health treatment, mutual aid, wellness checks instead of patrols, and a different form of justice that truly holds people accountable to the people and the communities they've harmed. It's called transformative reparative justice, where both the perpetrator, who has probably been a victim themselves, and the victim are repaired and transformed through the process with mediation, rehabilitation, and service. And finally, abolitionists do not believe that tomorrow we should wake up with no prisons, no jails, and no police. At least in the United States, we are not prepared for that. We have not built these life-affirming institutions yet, but that is the reason that we start with defunding. All of the money that goes to the police departments, the billions and trillions of dollars, should be defunded and reallocated so that we can build these life-affirming institutions. And when we're prepared to do that, we won't need cops in cages at all. I will now pass you on to co-founder Zoya.
Hello, pleasure to be here. Before I run through the demands, I just want to say that I absolutely agree with the other speakers here today, and that the ruling class has no incentive to listen to us. So we have to become impossible to ignore. And while there are many routes to action, and for us to obstruct business as usual, that for electoral progress to happen, it must work in tandem with grassroots pressure. So our demands, we researched and put together with a large group of people, and there are 10 of them. I'm going to start with number 1. Defund the police and reallocate resources to impacted communities. This includes disempowering police unions and other protections that prevent police from being accountable, and divesting and reinvesting into healthcare, education, and other social services. Number 2, to demilitarize the police. Disarm all law enforcement, including police officers and security guards, starting immediately with all military-grade weaponry and equipment. Enforce abuse of force laws, make all body and dash cam footage public, and the federal 1033 program that provides military weaponry to local police departments. Pass HR 1714, the Stop Militarizing Law Enforcement Act. require all burn grants be used for non-carceral alternatives to incarceration instead of police department militarization, and all grants from the Department of Homeland Security, Joint Terrorism Task Force, FBI, and Federal Justice Department, and all Pentagon giveaway defense appropriations, and all militarized international police training exchange programs, cancel all police and government contracts with private and public institutions that develop surveillance technologies, establish national, state, and local legal restrictions to prevent police departments from purchasing or using military weaponry. And just to underscore the importance of this, $6 billion is the New York Police Department budget, and it is the same as the entire defense budget of the country of Ukraine. Our police budgets are bloated and stealing resources from social programs that would prevent crime to begin with. Number 3, eliminate discriminatory policing, prosecution, and sentencing. Repeal the 1994 Crime Act, abolish Public Law 280, transfer authority directly to First Nations, and mandate that any criminal infraction on Indigenous lands be subject to sovereign nation laws, regardless of the individual as a member of the Indigenous sovereign nations. And broken windows policing, stop and frisk, racial profiling, repeat offender policing, gang policing, drunk driving checkpoints, neighborhood policing, immigration paperwork requests, and all other racially biased practices. Decriminalize poverty by repealing all laws related to the street economy and the occupation of public space, and mandatory arrest and failure to protect laws that lead to the criminalization of survivors of gender violence, and all fines and fees associated with the criminal legal process, including ticketing, cash bail, court costs, and parole and probation fees. Implement stringent limitations on the number of cases managed by public defenders. Limit prosecutorial discretion and prosecutor immunity. Immediately remove all law and oath-breaking judges. Document and publicly report racial and economic disparities on a court-by-court and judge-by-judge basis. Number 4, institute complete law enforcement transparency and accountability. Create an independent national database of police crimes, brutality, and misconduct. Implement independent community-led police department reviews and data audits. Require public reporting of all police records and schedules. Immediately terminate and eliminate pensions of any officer found guilty of manipulating data, covering their badge, turning off their body or dash cam, or illegally stopping a citizen from filming. And number 5, independently investigate all police crime and abuses of power. And qualified immunity. Ending qualified immunity is extremely important because it shields officers from any civil responsibility towards citizens. It allows them to escape accountability for indefensible crimes just because they hold a badge. Establish an independent national review board along with community level oversight committees to investigate all police officers or police department employees who have been involved in or witness to any police-related crimes. Implement immediate termination of any officer found guilty through independent investigation, and require that officers participate in a pre-established program of reparative justice. Mandate that any police-related crime against any member of a First Nations be addressed according to the Indigenous sovereign nations law. Require all costs of police-related lawsuits to be covered by officer pensions and/or personal liability insurance. Create a legal fund for victims of police brutality. Immediately dismantling any police department that violates civil rights. I'm going to hand off the mic to Anne to go through demands numbers 6 through 10. Is Anne ready to join us?
Is that Anne J? She should be.
No, I don't think so.
What's Anne's username?
It was
Annie Banani.
Ah, there we go. Sorry about that.
Okay, hi, 1 second. Okay, yeah, so like demand number 6 is install community representation, oversight, and safety measures. Elect independent community councils for needs assessment, municipal design, decision-making, and oversight. Prioritizing representation by marginalized groups. Invest in community-based public safety measures, including peacekeepers and wellness checks, intervention, violence prevention, skills-based education, mental health services, substance abuse treatment, mutual aid, mediation, and reparative justice. Mandate state-level monitoring for proper checks and balances. So this is basically just community oversight. We want to create committees for the people and by the people. For example, investing in social workers, first responders, and civilian corps. Demand number 7, end strategic counter-protest violence. Repeal all anti-protest laws. Terminate all officers guilty of arresting and applying unnecessary and excessive force against all protesters, or violation of their civil rights as guaranteed by the First Amendment. Ban the use of tear gas, pepper spray, rubber bullets, and all other crowd dispersal methods. Strip police authority to issue dispersal orders. Expunge all protest-related convictions and free all protesters in jail or prison. This is incredibly important because in the US, for those who aren't American, the First Amendment guarantees the freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. There was the largest protest lawsuit in the US was in 2014 in New York City at the Republican National Convention under Mayor Michael Bloomberg. The payout was over $10 million because several protesters were sent to a makeshift prison on the New York docks where they were actually, many of them got bacterial skin infections, and some of them were actually hospitalized right after. And with the Ferguson Black Lives Matter protest and the Occupy Wall Street protest and all throughout the US in 2000, I believe it's 2010 and 2012, so, tear gas and nightsticks were used on peaceful protesters. And a lot of governors had called in the National Guard, which is a military branch in the US, to police and to intimidate the protesters. That's why we need to end strategic counter-protest violence. Demand number 8, apologize and provide reparations. Publicly apologize and provide indemnification to victims of police violence and racial discrimination in policing, prosecution, and sentencing. Pass the Commission to Study Reparations Act, HR 40 and S 1083. Mandate Congress implement and enact recommended reparation proposals within 120 days of the submission of the Commission's report. Immediately begin reparation disbursement to improve the lives of African descendants in the United States and to foster economic, social, and political parity. Invest in equitable opportunities for First Nations and provide reparations for all descendants of Indigenous peoples of America. Recognize all First Nations and honor, perpetuate all treaties, including those not ratified, as well as obligations to self-determination and return stolen land. Issue and read a formal apology to Black and Indigenous peoples. Implement comprehensive, factual, and unabridged social studies pertaining to Black Americans and Indigenous peoples as part of the national curriculum to combat their erasure, foster compassion, and shift the paradigm of systemic and racism and implicit bias. So in the US, Black Americans are more likely to be incarcerated at 5.9 times the rate of whites, and Indigenous are about like 6 times the rate of whites. And in Canada, it's 10 times the rate of whites. So that's why it's important that we actually provide reparations and actually target these communities to help end their charging by the police. Number 9, end the war on drugs. End the criminalization of drug use and addiction. Pass the CARES Act of 2019. Expend all nonviolent drug-related convictions and layover risk, and provide mental health, behavioral health, and addiction recovery services nationwide. On Indigenous lands, provide resources for those services to be overseen by First Nations and implemented at the discretion of each sovereign Indigenous nation. Legalize marijuana at the federal and state level, and respect the sovereignty of First Nations that jurisdictionally protect all 573 recognized nations from any federal or state penalty for the cultivation of marijuana. Pass the Marijuana Businesses Access to Banking Act of 2015 and invest in state and federal revenue from legal marijuana into communities most impacted by the war on drugs. So studies have shown that whites use drugs at the same rate as every ethnic group, but Black and Indigenous are unfairly targeted. we actually have to, decriminalization and legalization also won't matter if we don't expunge all prior records. After all, we are a movement for racial and class justice. And there is that old adage that none of us are free until until everyone is free. Demand number 10 is end carceral punishment. Free everyone in jails, prisons, youth facilities, detention centers, beginning immediately with the elderly, disabled, and immunocompromised, nonviolent offenders, undocumented immigrants, criminalized survivors, and those held on bail for parole violations. Free all political prisoners, including Leonard Peltier and Mumia Abu-Jamal. Remove, except as a punishment for crime from the 13th Amendment. Ban solitary confinement. Decriminalize misdemeanor offenses and probation parole violations. Repeal all 3 strikes and habitual offenders laws. Ban the box. End the school to prison pipeline. Repealing truancy laws, removing police surveillance technologies and metal detectors from school, and eliminating 0 school tolerance discriminatory policies, suspensions, and expulsion.
I believe, was Awkward going to be finishing up this section for 10 demands? Awkward, did you want to come back on and close this, and we can move on to testimonials?
Yeah,
Making-
thank you. Just so everyone knows, I'm sure it was really hard to follow all of those details. So if you're looking for to be able to read it in your own time, you can go to 10forjustice.com. It's TENFOR justice.com. And I just wanted to give you guys a sense of positivity to close out. Since May 2020, organizers in 20 cities across the US have won more than 840 million in police department divestments and more than 160 million in community investments. So the work that we and others are doing is working and will continue to work in cities like Austin, in cities like Seattle, and in other small and large cities and towns nationwide.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Awkward, and everybody from 10 Demands and 10 Demands, co-creators of 10 Demands for Justice.